This video is going to focus on the post-colonial novels Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad and The Lonely Londoners by Sam Selvon. I'm going to do a quick comparison of the way that the two writers use narrative perspective and particular characters. In terms of the narrative perspective, Sam Selvon has chosen a third-person narrator. However, we do get a non-standard voice, so this third-person narrator is still speaking in a Caribbean dialect. And we see the consciousness of the protagonists through that narrative voice. So even though it's a third-person narrator, he does go inside the head of Moses and to a certain extent Galahad. Joseph Conrad, on the other hand, has chosen a first-person narrative. However, it's not a simple first-person narrative. The story is not entirely told from Marlowe's perspective. This is a framed narrative because at first we're introduced to Marlowe by another first-person narrator, and this is an anonymous first-person narrator. And Conrad has done this for a number of reasons, to take the readers outside of the story, to show off that Marlowe is an unreliable narrator. The perspective that he's giving us of his journey through the Congo is pointed out to us at the start of the novel as an unreliable, biased one. So both writers in different ways were very aware of the importance of voice. Whose voice is telling the story? How reliable is that voice? How important is it to give a voice to powerful people or less powerful people? Focusing more closely on Sam Selvon's use of narrative perspective, yes, it's third person, but we get this method of focalization. And that is a method of third person narrators going into the consciousness of the protagonist. So from the start, on page 1, we see that Moses has to get up from a nice warm bed, and we see how he feels about that. He don't know the man from Adam. So it's very important that Sam Selvon, and he was revolutionary in this, was going into the consciousness of the main protagonist, and thus he was giving a voice, which was revolutionary, to the less powerful people. He was directly trying to take the reader through the experience of one of the Windrush generation. Next, I'd like to focus on the symbolic significance of the names chosen by each writer. Firstly, we have Moses in The Lonely Londoners, and Moses in the Old Testament, of course, led the Israelites out of slavery, through the desert, and through the Red Sea to the promised land on the other side. And Sam Selvon has deliberately chosen to have Moses as the character in London who welcomes new people into London. Moses, like the other people arriving from the Caribbean, believed that England was a sort of promised land. And of course, when they arrive, it's a bitter disappointment. Another name chosen very deliberately by Sam Selvon to symbolise the irony of the Windrush generation hoping for a better life in England was Galahad. Galahad was a knight of the Round Table, and of course he journeyed to find the Holy Grail in the stories of the Round Table. Now, some of the Windrush generation saw England and the jobs and the lifestyle provided in England as a sort of Holy Grail, and of course Galahad's disappointment in this is another example of Selvon's irony through the symbolism of names. What of the two main characters in The Heart of Darkness? Firstly, we have our narrator Marlowe. The seafaring storyteller Marlowe is a common character across many of Conrad's novels. So why has Conrad chosen to have him again as our narrator in this story? Is it because he wants the reader to know and trust and like Marlowe and therefore believe his story? Most critics attribute the name and the character of Marlowe to Conrad's knowledge of Christopher Marlowe, the 17th century playwright. Conrad's father was a scholar who studied and translated Marlowe. The symbolism of Kurtz is slightly easier to unpick. The name Kurtz is a German name, but Marlowe points out that his father was half French and his mother was half English, and that all of Europe contributed to the making of Kurtz. Now, of course, at the start of this quotation, we have the pre-modifier, the adjective original. So the original Kurtz was made up of all of Europe. And as we know, when he goes into the heart of the Congo, he descends into a madness. Now, it's interesting to unpick, is his madness because of his mixed European origins, or is his madness a symbol of him losing those European influences? Either way, Kurtz is definitely a symbol of the Eurocentric colonialism of the time. In conclusion then, on the one hand, we have Joseph Conrad's choice of a first-person framed narrative, and we have Sam Selvon's choice of a focalized third-person narrative. We have some important symbolism in the main protagonists' and characters' names. Kurt, Moses, and Galahad's names are important, especially when we consider that they all take journeys, both physically and mentally. There is also the importance in both novels of biased perspectives and who is telling the stories of history and the stories of literature, and the importance of considering whose voice is telling those stories. Is it the more powerful or the less powerful members of society?